Hi, we are here with yet another show, and I think we are going to take a break from bringing so many people on board all at once. And I've been hearing all this feedback from people saying you're constantly on a roll. We can't just catch up and keep up with the videos we've been uploading. But I'm actually glad that we are going to end this week's session with yet another phenomenal woman. And I'm quite impressed. And we are honored to have Anne Hilton with us today. And she'll be talking about Indigenomics, something very close to my heart. And I'm a big advocate of Indigenous economics and Indigenous models as well. So over to you, Mark, and introduce us to Anne and what is the idea behind Indigenomics.
Thank you. So I'm going to introduce my good friend Anne Hilton. We've known each other for quite a long time. I work with her with the Indigenomics Institute, which she founded. She's based in Victoria in British Columbia. And Anne is an amazing, gifted visionary, as you'll soon hear. And so we wanted to, it feels like we're producing a Netflix series. Maybe we've done like 14 shows, so we're ready for a season, right? And which is fantastic. So I'm going to ask Anne to, share with us what is Indigenomics. And I'm your chief economist at Indigenomics Institute, and we have some really important work to do, I think, in terms of setting the table, as you said, for a new Indigenous incited or inspired economic model. So Anne, over to you.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you for having me here today and appreciate the invitation. Anne Hilton, CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute. I am of Nuu-chah-nulth descent on Vancouver Island. I have roots in the Hesquiaht Nation, just outside of Tofino and Ahousaht, and very much draw on that reality and that worldview to inspire what my work is today and what I'm working towards in achieving. So some of you may have heard of Indigenomics. It's a word that I created really as a social media handle, as a hashtag, to be able to establish a volume or a thread of work that identified this growing strength of Indigenous business, as well as to demonstrate the challenges that come with that growing strength. My work has really centered the significance of Indigenous resilience, that Indigenous economic growth is something that is outside of the narrative of how we would see or experience national or global economic growth. So Indigenomics is really a platform to be able to demonstrate the significance and visibility of an Indigenous worldview. As I began to distribute these stories, I began to see patterns that was very clear indication of how Indigenous people see the world in a different way and how it expressed itself through business. I identified a series of principles that, whether from South America, Africa, Australia, Hawaii, throughout Canada, that these themes had this golden thread of commonality around this concept of respect, around this concept of relationality, and this idea of the life force of respect for that, and how that expressed itself in teachings of who we are and expresses itself in our resiliency of how we do business today and how we relate to each other. So the concept of Indigenomics evolved over several years. And what I'm doing now through the Indigenomics Institute is modern Indigenous economic design. It's designing how powerful we are, building our economic presence, not through just revenue or profit, but actually understanding the connection between our inherent sense of responsibility to place to ourselves and to future generations, and how that reflects in our business models. The concept of constructive generative economic design has largely been shaped from what I see and what I choose to see. What I have seen in a significant volume of Indigenous economic research has been this story of lacking, this story of deficit, this story of, we can't keep up as people. And this story of that is very simplified into metrics that are a very real experience, metrics around poverty, metrics around our children, metrics around the number of people we have in jail, the number of our people that have diabetes, and we become defined by that narrative. So my work, particularly in Canada, has been a number of areas. Is one, to be able to see the Indigenous economy, to have Canadians understand the significance that, one, there is this thing called the Indigenous economy, two, that it needs to be invested and designed, and three, that Indigenous peoples cannot exist solely within the cost side of the equation of this country. As long as here in Canada, we see Indigenous people as a cost, that establishes itself as a historical narrative very much embedded in seeing Indigenous peoples as the Indian problem. So when we see Indigenous peoples as a problem, something to be removed, or as a barrier to progress or a barrier to economic development, it comes embedded with it a series of beliefs, a series of actions, and a way of behavior, which then reflects within policy. So being able to establish the business case for Indigenous economic design is what my work at the Indigenomics Institute has been focusing on. I'm currently just completed a book, Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. The concept of the book is to be able to center this concept of the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples from the economic table, and the ability to utilize the simplest metaphor of the table as a representation of economy. What becomes important in that is who is doing the inviting, who is currently sitting at the table, who is the decision making, and from which worldview is that filtered. The concept of Indigenomics is facilitating that there is another worldview. I refer to this concept of the descending ego of the mainstream economy. So being able to identify the characteristics of the ego of the economy itself is deeply embedded within worldview and the practices, the beliefs, and the actions that come from that. So being able to understand that ego and to address as if you are working with a childish human form. So the immaturity of that human form is that realization that once you're aware of the immaturity of it, that becomes essential in building the response. I'm very much in that realization that in this time of isolation and social distancing, aware of this global narrative that we're easily shaped and over hundreds of years have been shaped into believing that the economy holds up the sky. So if we are to believe that that is true, we need to understand the performance of the structures that hold up the sky. And with that concept, to be able to believe something different, what we are coming to terms with right now in this great pause or this great disruption is a number of key areas. One of those is the interplay between story, meaning, and information. So if we look at this concept of story, we are living in a moment, and our moments have all collectively been shaped by our worldviews, by religion, by economy, by displacement. And it's from this story today that many generations, this story will continue to be told. I draw on the words of master storyteller Richard Wagamese, who talks about story. He says, everything is story. All that we are is story. From the moment that we're born to the time that we continue to our spirit journey, we are involved in the creation of the story of our time here. It's what we arrive with. It is all that we leave behind. We are not the things we accumulate. We are not the things that we deem to be important. We are story, all of us. What comes to matter then is the creation of the best possible story we can while we are here. You, me, us together. When we can do that and we can take the time to share these stories with each other, we get bigger inside. We see each other. We recognize our kinship. We change the world one story at a time. We are at an intersection where we get to choose our story. What is the story we tell of this time? We are able to tell a story of what it is that we're choosing to see. What we have been given in this opportunity is the space to be able to see. So this interplay between the condition of the story, establishing meaning, and the information that we are told is the space that we are operating from. We can choose to see the human condition as in its current form. That current form has been shaped by thousands of years of some of us that may be colonization, some of that may be religion, some of us that may be poverty, some of us that may be displacement. If we look at the concept of consciousness as simply awareness of thought, it is this awareness of thought that shapes how and what we experience as reality. This pause in that we are essentially forced into is.
We've lost you, Carol.
Am I back now? Essentially, what I see as the appropriate response, the collective human choice we have in what the story that we are going to tell about this time is a shift in how we relate to each other. When I reflect back on the concept of Indigenomics, what I understand is an inherent relationality. So in my own Nuu-chah-nulth tradition, we have a concept called Hesquiaht. The concept is reflected as a broader, deeper meaning, as a model of reality to mean we are all connected, we're all related. And while that concept is globally expressed in thousands of different languages, it's an indigenous construct that allows futurism in the sense that we acknowledge the past and the original teachings that we come from. We acknowledge the present and the current responsibility of the present to make appropriate decisions for future generations. To be able to understand that what we are experiencing is a cognitive shift in how we relate to each other. This is relational economics. This is Indigenomics. This is a time where we are able to expose the gaslighting of the past thousands of years. The gaslighting that has said the economy holds up the sky, that money makes the world go around. This is a time where we're actually able to take a step back and examine what information are we processing? What is the meaning that is applied to that? If we can look with a critical eye and look from the eye of how we've experienced the past 10,000 years as humanity as a whole, how we process information is deeply embedded in our worldview. There is a freedom in this moment, and it's in this moment that I construct from. It is from this freedom that is most important to me to be able to construct from. I've heard of this construct of how do we pivot to this new reality. What I choose to see and what I choose to be able to create from is a choice of being able to understand what my responsibility is and what my response is to what I'm choosing to see. In my work today, establishing the Indigenomics Institute has been focusing again on this concept of modern constructive Indigenous economic design. I have essentially established a narrative, a pathway, and an agenda to be able to shape the establishment of a $100 billion Indigenous economy here in Canada. From its current value towards 100 billion is $68 billion of Indigenous economic activity. To bring visibility to that, to bring the construct of the reality of Indigenous economic strength is the place that I believe that the world is wanting to understand the significance and resilience of the growth of Indigenous business. My pivot in the COVID-19 moment, the story that I choose to tell, is the establishment of a global center of Indigenomics. This global center of Indigenomics will essentially hold a virtual global Indigenous marketplace. Marketplace, I don't mean of just the exchange of product. Marketplace, I mean, is the ability to facilitate Indigenous economic design from a modern perspective. At the Institute, I've established a concept called the Indigenomics Economic Mix. This is 12 levers to support the growth and design of the Indigenous economy and to sidestep the narrative of the socioeconomic gap and the levels of dependency and the negative statistics and the understanding of the ability to establish self-sovereignty and the ability to nation build from that. These 12 levers include examples such as trade, procurement, equity, capital, entrepreneurship, technology, clean energy, looking at those as hotspots for development and what we would describe as what progress can be in an Indigenous economy. So looking at these 12 levers, what becomes important is that it establishes a space for solutions, it establishes the space for leadership, it establishes the space for relativity to be able to form a global network supporting Indigenous values and Indigenous business. The last piece that this Global Center of Indigenomics will establish is the concept of an I-70. So the UN identified 70 and possibly closer to 90 countries with a majority Indigenous-based population. What I would like to be able to do is to bring the Indigenous leadership globally together to be able to establish the space to understand modern Indigenous economic design and its role within modernity and its role within humanity. So we have examples like the G7 or the G20, and to be able to model exactly Indigenous worldview and solutions, drawing from examples such as countries as Bolivia, looking at the rights of Mother Earth and the constructs of Indigenous economic design from an Indigenous worldview. Anika, did you have a question?
No, I was just going to say this is like music to my ears. And I'm sure that my colleagues from Africa would be so delighted. I'm going to share your interview with them because one of them is working on a model which is called, he has named it Nuu-chah-nulth from Zimbabwe. And Naka is basically the legacy. I'm sure he would be delighted. And just to say that whilst you were talking about the narrative and, you know, the African proverb about until the lion learns to ride, every story will glorify the hunter. So I think this is like, you are writing that story. So congratulations to you. I'm really, really so impressed and I'm so happy that I'm listening, I'm witnessing this day. So you are also building like global relationships with other Indigenous cultures and models, economic models.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So yours is like a platform for that
Yes.
collaboration. That's
Mhm.
fantastic. I'm going to introduce you to my colleague. Yeah.
Caroline, this is, of course, I've drank your Kool-Aid, and I love the vision. I love the metaphors and the image of the table, the narrative. In some of our shows, I've been pointing out that this man named Pythagoras supposedly had an indigenous Mongolian man come to him from afar to impart on Pythagoras, who gave us geometry and mathematics from the Greek world, said that every new civilization begins with a new narrative, an ecstasy. And I think you're describing, and very, I mean, your presentation is intoxicating, of course, but I think that's the theme of running through all of these discussions is, what is that new narrative? And it's fascinating that you're taking personal responsibility for writing and walking your narrative and inviting others perhaps to the table. And I think that's really important, the way you present yourself. You don't project it on anybody else. You're, in a sense, manifesting your own reality by walking into your narrative, and hopefully others may find it compelling. What gives you hope that this new narrative will prevail over a system that I would say we have all been colonized, you know, whether money system or whatever, the neoliberal economic theology, I'll call it theology because it's a set of beliefs that underscores our current economic system. What gives you hope that we will actually make that transition, transcend this trauma, and embrace what is far more compelling, as you've, I think, laid out?
Sure. I was a baby scholar, probably about 18 years old, studying psychology 101 or something to that effect. And my professor at the time, it was a psychology of the human mind. So he described the evolution and different theories and the limitations of those and the limitations of psychology itself. And we delved into great lengths of the philosophers and the scientists and the contrasts and conflictions of really the evolution of the willy-nilly to consciousness and awakeness. And as a young scholar, that deeply influenced this introduction that the actual physiological establishment of the human pause in terms of processed thinking allowed the space for greater options. And he demonstrated, you know, across other life forms that that ability to pause was distinctly human and was directly related to our consciousness. And I believe very much in this time right now of reflecting in this space of being a great pause, that this is a collective disruption in the collective memory of humanity. So it's in this awakening to be present in what we see. And I think that essentially it's a wake-up call. We are going to address the pause, or we're going to just keep going. I talk about in my book about a metaphor that deeply influences my thinking as a Nuu-chah-nulth person. So Indigenous peoples have supernatural beings that are able to expand the way that we see things and create possibility of other forms of reality. So being able to understand the significance of the thunderbird and a double-headed sea serpent. The Global Center of Indigenomics, I bring forth a lightning bolt through the earth with an Indigenous representation, is that the concept of Indigenomics is established as a platform to jolt the system, to be able to poke a hole in the story of how we experience economy, how we experience money, how we experience ourselves. So the story of the Thunderbird is directly related to the Double-Headed Sea Serpent. So the Thunderbird sends down lightning bolts and feeds on whales. And the concept of the Double-Headed Sea Serpent is a metaphor that is very much relevant to this time. So the story is told essentially that if you ever come across a double-headed sea serpent, that it is so gruesome that you return inside of yourself and live in fear. But you have a choice when you see that gruesome sight, that because it has two heads, that you can withdraw and live in fear, or you can stand in your truth. And when you stand in your truth, you address the double-headed sea serpent and it collapses into itself. I use that story as a metaphor to demonstrate that the double-headed sea serpent is really the economic systems of what we experience reality and what we're told that is. So we can withdraw into fear at this moment, or we can stand in our truth and choose what we want to be able to see. Let's have the courage to do this together. Thank you.
Wow. John, you're speechless.
Can I call you Sister Carol?
Caroline.
Caroline, can I call you sister?
Yes.
It's my language. You're speaking my language. I didn't have to make any effort whatsoever to understand exactly what you were saying and where you were coming from. Every single word. Music to my ears. I cannot imagine what wisdom and possibilities exist in indigenous cultures. How many of them are there, did you say, around the world?
I think Caroline froze. Oh, she's coming back.
Hi, Caroline.
Caroline, did you hear John's question?
No, I didn't.
Caroline, how many indigenous cultures are there in the world?
There are thousands and thousands and thousands of indigenous cultures. There's indigenous cultures inside of indigenous cultures.
That is true.
How many people? Do you have any idea?
The last time I heard, I thought it was like 370 million I was able to identify, but that may have been a dated number now.
Do you anticipate forming some sort of global body?
Yes, so the establishment of the I-70 would be a global Indigenous Economic platform.
Has this been raised already?
I'm currently creating it while in isolation.
Bless you.
I happen to have a friend who is a member of the G20. That may be helpful. Keep it in mind.
Yes, for sure.
I think it's wonderful because, quite honestly, we've got to go somewhere else to find the truth and to find out how to sustain ourselves individually and collectively.
Yeah, and I think building up this concept and space for relational economics, that is what I'm speaking to. And this is the time to be able to look at how our systems have separated us, how our beliefs have separated us, how our practices have separated us, and how our return to how we relate to each other is the opportunity here.
Absolutely. I think this is a magical time, actually, and I mean magical.
Very powerful.
I haven't seen, it's extraordinary how things are transforming during these few weeks. It's been a wonderful opportunity. And out of this must come some great graces, I think. I cannot imagine that they're not going to flourish and become realities. And I hope that yours really is rapidly achievable. God bless you. And thank you so much. I've loved what I've heard. In fact, these last few weeks and these programs have introduced me to the indigenous cultures for the first time. Not that I was totally, I spent some time with the Aboriginal people in Australia a few years ago. But I recognize the wisdom inherent in that culture and therefore had to assume that it was the same case. We've ignored them at our peril. And you've articulated it so beautifully. You're a wonderful spokesman, wonderful spokesman.
Thank you.
And you filled my heart with great optimism and hope.
Good.
So I thank you for that. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
So I think, as John was saying, it's sort of the wisdom is inherent in the model. So nobody has maybe written about it as in the theory of economics. So are you working on that you are now, I'm sure there are many models, but are you writing about one particular model of the indigenous cultures? Because I'm sure it sort of transmits, it's inherent, the wisdom is inherently in the model, and they don't sort of document as we do in the modern world. Would you say that?
Right. I think I have prevented from describing it specifically as a model because there's so much diversity, both nationally and globally. What I've done is tie the threads of connectivity to the concept and then built the construct of economic design. So there's one part philosophical that suggests the way that we see the world has significance and impact in how we build business. And then the other is actually constructive generative economic design. So moving away from the deficit, moving away from seeing the Indian problem and seeing economic empowerment. So I present the option to see and experience Indigenous economic empowerment today.
Yeah, may I also comment? I think, you know, it's interesting, Caroline, you sort of, I mean, some people might stop and go, what are you talking about, $100 billion, you know?
Sorry, guys, I don't know if that's my...
all that concrete behind you, Caroline.
System's a little full.
I was saying, Caroline, for some listeners, I might feel like, wow, you went from this double-headed sea serpent to talking about Indigenous GDP, which of course is part of the colonizers' model, right? And the national income accounting model that I'm familiar with. But I think what's exciting for the listeners is to understand that not only do we have a, you know, we're setting a table, we're sort of creating a condition in which the Indigenous wisdom, you know, of abundance, right? Of, you know, working with Indigenous people. I remember that meetings always went well when we started with smudging, when you started with prayer, not Robert's rules, but prayer. And so there was always a, you know, thank you, Creator, for what we have, reflection that brings us together and unifies us. And from there, we begin our business, our relationships. And from there, we construct elaborate systems of exchange. And we have the Potlatch in the West, we have the Sweat Lodge, you know, we have the ayahuasca, whatever the protocols are. And in the West, we bring the accounting framework and the tools that have been part of our world for 500 years or so. So what's exciting to me is that economic table, I think, reflects the truth of abundance on Turtle Island, and those traditions which have not been lost, thank goodness. We tried to kill it. We were pretty successful at, you know, killing the Indian and negating those customs which really reflected the truth of, you know, this. We began with Mr. Abadi, who's founder of the BCCI, one of the largest banks, and John was part of that, and talking about why Mr. Abadi and his philosophies receive resistance in the financial world. When you express clear statements like all wealth comes from God, in a sense, that we are each other's brothers and sisters keeper, that money is not scarce, it's meant to be shared, and as are all assets. So I think for me, that's exciting as an economist, is we're establishing this on a new foundation, new principles, and well, not a new one, an old one. And the narrative has never been lost. If anything, we have been asleep in the West, and under a spell, in a sense. And so that doubles, you know, I love the fact that we stand in our truth, and this was what gives us courage. So thank you for.
Awesome. Thank you very much.